Ordinary people doing extraordinary things with me, Mark Christie.
We're not having audio, visual, sorry.
No, I don't want this face on YouTube. Okay, today I'm here with Nigel Hooper from West Suffolk College. Hello, Nigel.
Hello, Mark. How are you?
I'm okay. Now, obviously, you're my tutor at West Suffolk, but I suspect that there may be some other tales you might have to tell about something that, or some things you may have done in the past. Let's start with, where were you born, for example?
I was born in what people used to refer to as the car park of the West Midlands, a place called Walsall. Now, Walsall, heart of the Black Country, next to Dudley. And when I was growing up, it was a bit of a rough area. In retrospect, when you're a kid, you don't see that.
No.
Yeah, everything's a playground. And everything's new to explore. And I actually officially went to the worst school in Britain because I remember reading an article in a newspaper once, I think this was in the early 2000s, where my school, which I won't name, was actually labelled as the worst comprehensive school in the country. And it's almost something that I'm proud of. You know, my humble beginnings. I come from a single parent family. My father was a musician, still is probably, and still alive, I think, somewhere in the world, and was a pianist. Left when I was really small, and I have one elder brother who became a policeman, and I grew up literally in a council house opposite what I thought at the time was a hotel for older people, but found out that but obviously as I grew older, realized it was a care home, and wondered why all these people used to keep on moving out and new people used to keep on coming in. But that was interesting because literally my house faced the care home. So I used to know quite a lot of the old people as I was a kid, and I used to annoy them as well, partly because I used to play football against the walls of the care home, and used to bounce the ball up and down. And I always used to get people coming out saying, "Stop making that racket," but never realised, as you don't as a kid, the irritation that you're causing other people at the time. But yeah, my sort of growing up period in Walsall was a real mixture of things. I was a nervy kid. I was very insular. And that might have been because my mother had a hard time bringing two sort of very raucous boys up on her own. In many ways, we were fortunate. She met someone else, my stepfather, Brian, who had an army background. We got out of there. We moved a bit further down the road into a house, a normal house, rather than a sort of a plywood sort of building, terraced building, which we were brought up in. I suppose we got to have a bit of a normal life. And my sort of youth was literally not realizing that I was one of the very few white kids in my school. And again, it's one of these things where it's a big thing now, you know, Black Lives Matter and the whole thing about racism. But as a kid, you don't see that. You don't see color. You see friends. And actually, my two best friends at the time was a chap called Mahinder Singh, a very typical Indian name, Mahinder Sharma, actually, and who used to be known as Johnny. That was his sort of middle name, or the name that I knew him by. And he had 5 brothers and 2 sisters. And in a stereotypical kind of way, his family owned the corner shop in the local village, which again wasn't necessarily a thing that I thought was abnormal or stereotypical because I was a kid. And actually, where I lived was near a place called Palfrey Park, which is in the sort of the ring road of Walsall town. And where my friend lived, it was in a place called Karma. Now, Karma now is probably a place where, as an adult, I wouldn't walk through. But as a kid, it was a seriously interesting place full of different ethnicities, different sounds, different smells. My best friend and his family, who I tended to live with most of the time, because they were really into music, and he had an attic, and we used to play. That's where I really started guitar playing, and my first band, if you like. And we used to use his attic as a little rehearsal space, and basically compete with each other as to how good we were all the time. So, and I remember the girls on the corner who used to know me by name. They used to shout out, "Hi, Nigel, how you doing?" As I used to go into my mate's shop and then go at the back door, because that's where they lived as well. They lived above the shop. Not realizing till later, obviously, that they were the local friendly ladies for the local community. But again, I used to know them by name, and it's great. It's that magical era of when you're a kid, not realizing the how the world works.
When was it? 70s, 80s?
This is 70s, mid 70s. I was actually, when Elvis died, 77.
77, yeah.
77 was probably the first year I realized.
August, I think.
Yeah, it's probably the first year I realized I was 10, 10 going on 11, I think. And I'm trying to do my maths now, level 2 in maths. And I think that's the first time I realized where I was, who I was, what I was sort of trying to be. I had more freedom. I could walk around being a sort of 10-year-old. I think there's less safeguarding or scariness for parents during that era. I think everybody just got on with things.
Yeah.
I used to walk through the park, the Palfrey Park, to get to my mate to go to Karma, and I used to play in Palfrey Park, and it's one of those things where, in retrospect, probably wasn't the safest of places for kids to go, because there's loads of needles and things like that around. But you don't see that as a kid. You just don't see it. And it's funny, as you get older, you look back and think, wow, would I allow my own kids to go to those places? And no is the answer. But, it was a different era. And we just explored, I suppose, more than anything else. And I suppose, my growing up, my brother became a police cadet when he was 16. He was sort of forced into it to a certain extent because he needed to do something. He was going off the rails. He's older than me. He's 4 years older than me. And he was a bit of a rebellious kid, looking back. And he ended up going into which I thought at the time was a bit odd, going into the police force, and became a copper literally for a large majority of his life. Until it really got to him and he had to sort of retire, which he was very happy to do, because I think the West Midlands Police Force wasn't particularly well known as a good police force.
I don't think they were very liberal back then. No,
they weren't. And I think my escape, the people that when I was at school, either used to go in the local factories. And my next door neighbour, who was the same age as me, he went into a factory when he finished school, and I just wanted to escape. And the reason why I wanted to escape, I think, is because my best friend at the time, his whole family moved away, and they moved to London. So I lost total touch. And this is the era where we didn't have the internet, we didn't have mobile phones, we had letters. You lose touch with people. So the best friend of my growing up years just literally left, because his family decided they're going to move. I don't know what ever happened to them. That's it's one of those things, and you never know what happened to them. But I think that gave me the inspiration of, I've got to get out of this place. I don't want to live here. I don't want to sort of grow up here and work here and live in this town. I want to try and explore. And the only option for me was to go to college or to uni. That was the only option. There's no other way out. I couldn't see any other way out. And I wasn't particularly academic. I actually took a year out between going to college and ending school to retake another A level and decide what I wanted to do. And in that gap year, I ended up working in a factory for a short period of time. Ended up becoming a driver's mate, which probably wasn't a great idea because I took him around the wrong way of the M25. And this is the days without sat-nav. This is when I had to read maps. I don't think I was employed very long for that job, because we were supposed to get to this place in Kent at something like 6 o'clock in the evening, and we ended up getting there at 2 in the morning. And that was my fault. And then we delivered, literally, I remember this, we delivered like a flat pack pieces of furniture into an empty room. And there was so much of this flat pack that by the time we left at 2 in the morning, they let us in as well at that time. They were in tears. The people we left this flat. I can remember it. I mean, I was only young when I was doing this. I was only 17 or something. And I can remember thinking, this ain't right. I shouldn't be doing this for a living. I've got to get out. And the one thing I was quite good at was art, was drawing and illustration and music, but I could never see a future with music at that time. And I applied to this college called Bretton Hall. And Bretton Hall was a very, and again, I didn't know this at the time, but it was a really interesting place and very unique. The Bretton Hall College sort of approach was all about creative education. It was all about creative approach. And I was in the same year as Steve Pemberton and Mark Gatiss and Rhys Shearsmith, who became the League of Gentlemen.
Yeah.
And I was, and this college also had John Osborne, the playwright there. He'd gone there. It had quite a few actors, well-known actors and actresses, and it was a real sort of a center of creativity. And what I found interesting, I mean, it was connected to Leeds University, but it was almost like the creative arm of Leeds University. They validated the degrees. But it was in a mansion. It was stuck in the middle of the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. So I lived literally in the first year in the Yorkshire Sculpture Park in Bretton Hall.
Wow.
And so your surroundings were beautiful countryside and Henry Moore sculptures in the landscape and massive lakes. And they filmed Women in Love, the Alan Bates and Oliver Reed film.
Yeah.
They filmed that in the mansion there. So it was a really creative, inspiring place. And because I'd always played guitar. I was a bedroom guitarist when I was at home. That's how I sort of survived. I sort of basically went to my room and just played hours of guitar and drew things. That's the only two things I really did, because I wasn't necessarily academic. I did A-level art, but as you know, sort of the whole educational route was very formulaic. Didn't give you sort of options to be creative as such. You had to sort of follow rules. And what Bretton Hall did was just say, well, what do you want to do? How do you want to be creative? And so I ended up doing a 3-year degree in art design and music. And in my first term at that college, I played guitar in my room. And I found out that and I was in room 3 of this hostel. And in room 1 was a guy called Tim Pike, and he was a bass player. And in room 2 was a guy called Matthew. Can't remember his last name now. And he was a keyboard player. And literally, this was the first time we ever met. Obviously, we're in digs. So because we're all different instrumentalists, we had different instruments. We thought, well, let's get together. Let's play a band. And somebody who was on the top floor, it was a 3-floor sort of student accommodation. The girl, Joanna, her name was, she was a music student, but she was going out with an older guy from where she came from, Cockermouth in Cumbria. I remember that. Peter, his name was, and he wrote a musical called Going Forth by Day based on the Egyptian afterlife. And he had this idea of, well, I know, I want to tour it, and I need some musicians. And he heard my guitar playing through the window of my student accommodation, knocked on the door and said, would you be interested in playing guitar for this musical? And this is in the first term. And I went, yeah, all right. What have I got to lose? He says, I can't pay you money, but I can buy you effects, and I'll pay for the travel to venues and things like that. And we're hoping to go to Edinburgh Festival. And so they had a massive, suddenly this idea became quite a big concept. And they got a BBC broadcaster on board. I can't remember the chap's name, but he used to do some TV broadcasting, and he was a radio voice as well for a short period of time. So it was a musical that was narrated by 2 people. We ended up rehearsing. And he took us to various rehearsal places. There was one in Cockermouth in a village hall, and there was one in a very famous private music school in the heart of North Yorkshire, which I'm sure if somebody mentioned the name, I'd remember. And he hired the music area for us to rehearse this musical, because he'd already planned for some gigs, and we had a touring schedule. We ended up recording this musical and performing it in Wakefield Cathedral. I remember that one. And the Sand Centre in Carlisle. Now, the Sand Centre in Carlisle is like a 5,000 to 8,000 venue, people venue. It's a big venue. It's the big venue up in Carlisle. And we sold out. We played it, and I managed to sort of do what I was supposed to do. We ended up in vans, the back of vans, traveling, sleeping in the back of vans, traveling to sort of places, and typical sort of thing as a kid, you think this is the way a musician lives.
Yeah.
I got paid with guitar effects and a food, and literally just for the fact of doing something a bit different. And we were just about to sort of head to Edinburgh. I remember this. This is in the first year of my college life. And the guy who was looking after all the finances ended up sending everybody a postcard saying that it's not happening anymore. Thank you for all your, because he was there obviously when we did the gigs, but suddenly the Edinburgh thing didn't happen because I think he went off with all the money, as it happens. So that was the end. That was the burgeoning or the beginning of my musical career. And I ended up with a couple of effects pedals and a memory, which was quite good. And the fact that I played to lots of people, and I've still got a tape recording, a cassette tape recording of this musical somewhere, which I must fish out. I have no idea where it is. It'd be fascinating to find actually now we're talking about it. And I've got some old photographs of my period during that. But I found Bretton Hall really interesting because my 3 years there was not only that in the first year, but also I connected with a folk singer called Alan Taylor, who you'll probably know that name because he's got in touch with us again. And he taught at that college for 3 years, the 3 years that I was there. So I ended up working with him and doing sort of various bits and pieces. And I never realized until actually after the fact that he was actually quite well known sort of singer-songwriter, and had sold his songs to various people at that time who were people like Nana Muscuri and people like that who covered his songs. And he's earned a living out of being a folk singer-songwriter. And so in retrospect, these years go so quickly, and you look back and you think, wow, some great opportunities there. My major was in art. I rarely turned up. And I remember one year, I think it was my second year, I spent most of it either playing music or touring or painting in my student accommodation. And I think I turned up at the end of the year with some paintings for an exhibition that we had to do. And the tutor turned around to me and said, I thought you'd left. I went, no. Oh yeah, I probably should have been in touch, shouldn't I? I said, all right, okay, we'll see what you got for your exhibition, and we'll see where we go from there. Luckily, I managed to stay on, so I wasn't a great student, and yeah, I managed to get my degree and stuff, and then I, typical me, I didn't want to work. I didn't want to work for a living, but I was poor. I was in debt. I was living on credit cards. This was really interesting. And I thought, well, okay, what I want to do is, let's do another qualification. I'll go to Bournemouth. I'll do an MA in computer animation because it was all the rave. These computers and this whole computer animation. This is pre-Toy Story, by the way.
What sort of dates are we talking about here?
So 1990.
Right.
I think it was 1990 I did my MA, and it was a calendar year, so it was a whole year. And in that year, again, I met some really interesting people. We did there used to be this festival called the Computer Graphics Festival. And we did the titles. In fact, Bournemouth, where I went, was the Apollo Centre for Computer Animation, the first in the country. Yeah. Again, something I never realised. And Apollo were massive machines at the time. I think they've been overtaken by various other machines these days. But we used to program in C++, and it was all coding then. And so I literally did a year of coding and trying to be creative with animation. And we ended up doing the titles for this Computer Graphics Festival 1990. And that was the first year that I saw a Pixar animation, which was put on at the Computer Graphics Festival, which happened in London. Getting there was an interesting journey. Here's another story, because my tutors, there was two. One, they were both sort of, you would probably call them geniuses, because they were really high on computer programming, and they're all doctors and professors of what they did. And here was me, just an art student, basically trying to do an MA in computer animation in this newfangled universe of computers that I never knew about. I mean, my dissertation for my degree at Bretton Hall was done on an electronic typewriter. So again, we didn't use computers in those days. So I was new to this whole area, as was most of the generation. So it was a very new and exciting thing. But we ended up going to the Computer Graphics 1990 festival, and we took a minibus. There was a small crowd of us. We were the first year of this student cohort, so there was only about maybe 15 of us in that student year, the first year they'd ever run it. SMA, and we went, and the tutors obviously organised the festival. Unfortunately, halfway there, having stopped at a pub for lunch, the tutor who was driving got really drunk and couldn't drive any further. And so I was the only person who had a full driving license. So I had to drive the rest of the way. So not only was this a bizarre experience, and I was driving a student union minibus that the tutors had hired. I probably wasn't even legal, but because I was the only one who could drive, I ended up driving into London, which is my first experience of driving into London as well. And then I had to drive them all back because they got really even more drunk. This was in the days where your tutors could get pissed with you without getting fired.
The good old days.
Yeah, the good old days. And so, yeah, that year for me was really interesting because, again, I met some really interesting people. In fact, some of the people from there went on to work in the Moving Image Company, which, again, was, I think Paddy, who was a student at the same time as me, was one of the first people to work in that company. And that company has produced computer animation for major films like Star Wars and all of this. I think he's probably still there. I don't know. Again, these things where you lose touch with people as you move on. And then by the time I finished my MA, living in a flat in Bournemouth, realizing that I maxed out all the credit cards that I had and couldn't survive anymore. I think probably by the end of 1990, I was probably in about £10,000 worth of debt. And this is 1990. I know it's bizarre. At the time, you don't think as a kid, I suppose, what was I? I was maybe 20, 21, going on 21, maybe 22. Money never registered with me. The idea of money I never thought about the importance of it, if you like. It was just there. And why wasn't it there? How do I get it? And actually, they just give me this card and I can spend on it, so I'll do that. And then suddenly I was realizing, I really need to get a job. So my girlfriend at the time was from the college, from my previous college. So I went back there while she finished off her degree. And then she was a musician and she got an offer from a friend about teaching in the Faroe Islands, and they needed a guitar teacher. And I thought, well, you know what? The last couple of months I've been working in a chicken factory and earning sort of minimum wage to pay off my grand debt. I think I better do something. So let's leave the country, go and live in the Faroe Islands and see what happens. And what happened was we literally left the country. We left everything, went and lived in the Faroe Islands and became music teachers. Brilliant. Thanks for your time, Mark.
You too. Cheers, man.